Mean to say last coffee. If you need coffee desperately, please go help yourself. Sounded like a threat almost. My name's Dan Hamilton. I'm the director of the Center for Transatlantic Relations here at SAIS at Johns Hopkins. And we're really delighted to partner with our colleagues in Europe, particularly through the Aspen Institute, to put on I think, pretty relevant set of topics on the table of how we are talking across the Atlantic these days. So we're going to have a panel here to start us off, but since we're doing this with the Aspen Institute, I just want to introduce Elliot Gerson, who's the Executive Vice President of Policy and Public Programs, dealing with partners for the Aspen Institute here in Washington, and my old friend, Mircea Joana, who's the President of Aspen Romania, but was the Foreign Minister and was the ambassador here when I worked with him very closely on many issues. It's so good to see you. So, Elliot, if you want to say a word or two and what this is all about, and we'll go from there. I should say, I don't know if Elliot knows that, I worked for 10 years for the Aspen Institute in Berlin when there was a wall there. It's a very different place, Aspen, Berlin, with Shepherd Stone, and that was quite an outpost at that time. So I have old memories of Aspen that are good.
Well, thank you. I was going to speak just 2 words, but now that you said that, I may add a third because I was going to note that. And you know, the Aspen Berlin was the first of our overseas partners more than 40 years ago, and at that critical time in East-West transatlantic global relations, really was a critical outpost in West Berlin. And we're very proud of that early period. As a matter of fact, Shep Stone is still honored each year at a big event in Berlin. That institute is now known as Aspen, Germany. But let me just say a word about how pleased the Aspen Institute in the United States is about these developments. And also, again, just a special thank you to you, Dan, and to SAIS for hosting this event. As I just mentioned, we have had overseas partners of the Aspen Institute for more than 4 decades. For those of you in the room not familiar with Aspen, it's probably worth noting that these are not anything like company-owned shops or even franchises or affiliates. They are entirely independent organizations, legally, financially, operationally. They share our goals and aspirations and our values. And essentially, we grant them the right to use our name. And I'm particularly delighted to say that at this critical juncture in transatlantic relations, our 7 European partners, as you heard, starting with Germany and France and Italy, followed 10 years after that. And more recently, other Aspens have been established in Europe. Mircea Joana was one of the first of the additional ones, but we now have them in Spain and Central Europe, headquartered in Prague, and as well most recently in Ukraine. And we're delighted, actually, to have Natalie Juresko here with us today, who played a critical role as finance minister after the events of the Maidan and putting together a new government, and now has assumed new responsibilities to salvage the economic welfare of Puerto Rico. Not exactly a transatlantic challenge, but nonetheless a very big one. So we're delighted to see her here as well. In any event, now that we have 7 Aspen Institutes in Europe, and at such a critical time, they, on their own initiative, have decided to do more collectively and to provide a voice for leading European figures on issues of relevance within Europe, and particularly on a transatlantic basis. And in particular, they have established something called the Aspen European Strategy Group, modeled very directly on the Aspen Strategy Group of the Aspen Institute in the United States, an organization you're all familiar with, co-chaired by Joe Nye, until recently Brent Scowcroft, and more recently Condé Nast, and directed by Nick Burns. They have met with that group, and based on the reports from just the last day. I'm delighted to say it looks like this is going to be a continuing dialogue between this group in Europe and the Aspen Strategy Group in the United States. So I simply again want to thank everyone for being here, thank our European colleagues for their initiative, and do believe that the time is ripe for this kind of an exchange at a time where questions are being asked about the transatlantic relationship in a context that none of us have seen before. With that, I want to just bring up our mutual friend, Mircea Joana.
Thanks, Elliot. Thanks, Dan, for having us. It's good to see the old, what we used to call in an affectionate way, the transatlantic mafia coming together. I think there is a need for us, the ones who believe that the links between Europe and America are a cornerstone for global governance and global order, to come together again. When 65 years ago the Aspen Institute was started after the Second World War, the Aspen idea was basically to bring together principled, value-based leadership and a critical conversation about the issues that are tormented modern societies. And I'd like to thank Elliot and Claire and Jonathan for nurturing many of the new Aspens in Europe. I look here to see Mikhail Zvantovsky. We've been working together as ambassadors here, and Ivan and Natalie. We are still young in spirit. And I also like to thank our friends from Aspen, Italia, because when we started this enterprise in Romania 10 years ago, the Aspen Institute in Romania was not the obvious place to start an Aspen Institute. That's why our American friends who were a little bit more strict with a potentially naughty child. And I think this is what really we're benefited from, for a very strict coaching. Aspen US and Aspen Italia were very instrumental to our start. What I'm just trying to say that this is one of those moments. And of course we all try to read in the tea leaves what Trump would be going to do, what Merkel would be doing, and what the Chinese president would be doing, what the hell is going on in Qatar and in Tehran these days. But in fact, I think we have to come back to the original idea, because this is the universal idea. This is about freedom. This is about dignity of human lives. This is something that I believe is the only way to really move forward. Then, and I recommend you look to that resilience, forward resilience that Dan has been putting forward. Resilience of our idea cannot come only from tactical solutions, cannot come only from ad hoc, adaptive, reactive policies to what happens in America or in China or in Germany or in Romania or wherever. We have to go back to the original idea. The original idea is simple. We have to invest, and this is what we do on grand scale, in young leaders from all over the world. And if there is something I hope we'll see after this first iteration of the Aspen Europe Strategy Group and Aspen Initiative for Europe, is that we'll have real common projects. And I'm also inviting SAIS and Dan Hamilton and the Center here to embark with us on a number of selected, and of course we have to find resources, but that's not the issue. I think that today we are confronting the most profound challenge to the way in which we thought the world could be run. I think we have a challenge that we have to confront with an idea. I think we have a challenge that needs to be confronted with like-minded people. Yesterday we had the first meeting between the Aspen Europe Strategy Group and Aspen US Strategy Group. We decided to have a regular exchange of views both in Europe and in America. But what we are doing here today, and what we've been doing for the last 3 days, is to re-engage our natural partners, individuals, intellectuals, people with ideas, but also institutions in this common effort. So to Dan and to SAIS and to the Center, thank you so much for hosting us. To Marta and the impeccable team that has been working like crazy to keep a bunch of 7 Aspen Institutes in Europe together in one program, I have to say that this is, even by Romanian standards, a difficult act to follow. And to Elliot, to Claire, to Jonathan, to our friends from Aspen, US, thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Without nurturing and guidance, I think we had not been in the position to go so far. And the last point is that I'm very happy, and this is speaking now as Aspen, Romania, that the fact that we proved that in an exotic place like Romania, the Aspen idea can really flourish, as it did in the last 10 years. I think this was an encouragement for the Aspen US board to go more aggressively, in the good sense of the term, in opening new Aspens. This is not a franchise. Elliot is right. This is an idea which is put in any soil, in any corner of this planet. This seed will grow and will be able to harvest. So my encouragement to the Aspen board and to the International Committee and to Elliot and to Claire is to continue to be offensive, to be on the offensive, because the more Aspens we'll have around the world, I think the better chance for us to withstand this fantastic pressure that is on us. And the last point, I'm convinced we will prevail. I have no doubt whatsoever that our idea of freedom and human dignity will prevail. Of course, populism and negative stuff is always easier to have to bear fruits. In political terms, I used to be a relatively active politician myself. I'm absolutely convinced that we will prevail. But in order to prevail, we have to really get out of the comfort zone. We have to get out from the way in which we organize ourselves. I think this is the challenge. And if there is a panel that can really address this kind of perennial ideas and values in a new convulsive international and global format, this is where Dan and Marta and all the friends in front of you, I'm convinced, will bring a glimpse of hope. We never give up. We'll prevail. And I think the Aspen idea and the like-minded people all over the world will have the final say. It's just a battle, my friends. The final victory will always be on the good side of history. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to turn to our discussion. I just want to introduce my colleague, Marta Dasu, who has been leading this initiative. And I think many people know Marta. She has been with Aspen for a very long time in Italy, but was also the Deputy Foreign Minister of Italy. She is the publisher of the Aspenia sort of journal that they produce, but I think everyone knows Marta. She's been around in the transatlantic field for many years. So I'm going to turn to Marta. My colleague Kurt Volker had to bail out at the last minute. He used to work here with us, so they asked me to step in, and I'll try to do my best as part of that. And but I'm going to turn to Marta now, who will moderate our session.
Okay, and you will be a speaker. Thanks, Elliot, Mircea, and thanks, Dan, for having accepted to run this joint initiative. It is the first time that we are all together in Washington as Aspen European Strategy Group, and I hope we will be able to give you an assessment on how we see the situation today. I think that the general topic we have to discuss in this 1 hour and a half or so is whether this crisis in transatlantic relations is a structural one, a deep crisis, or is it a somewhat temporary crisis due to a bad personal chemistry, first of all, between Mr. Trump and Angela Merkel. We have seen it during the G7 we ran in Italy, and right after, with some negative declarations. In particular, what struck us was the declaration made by Angela Merkel, according to which an entire era is over in transatlantic relations. We Europeans, in her words, cannot rely any longer on others. We have to become much more independent and autonomous. So I would like to start immediately with Daniela Schwarzer. She's the director of the Research Institute at the German Council on Foreign Relations. And I would like to ask you, Daniela, what do you think about that? Do you think that the Chancellor was, in a sense, driven herself by her own domestic audience? Germany will have elections, as we all know, at the end of September, and the American factor has always played a role in electoral campaign. I remember 2003, the Iraqi war, Schroeder deciding to say no, clearly, also for electoral reasons, also for matter of, he was against the war clearly, but there was an electoral reason behind. And really, this is a very important point to understand. How much domestic politics is it in the Chancellor declarations, and how much Angela Merkel is rightly underlining the fact that the Cold War is finally over and we have to start a new period in transatlantic relations in which the relationship must become much more balanced. Please, Daniela.
Thank you very much, Marta, and thanks to all of you for having me on this group. These have been terrific. Almost 3 days in DC, and the discussions were extremely interesting for me to participate in. Now, I think that to answer your first or one of your questions very, very quickly, of course there is an element of electoral campaigning in what Merkel said, how she said it, and where she said it.
Yeah.
So that is natural. I mean, we are 4 months away from general elections in Germany, and foreign policy, defense issues, Europe, and transatlantic relations play a very strong role in this year's campaign. And so it was, to some extent, an anticipation of where one of the major, now coalition partners, but then political opponents in the general elections, the Social Democrats, may be going in their statement on Trump and transatlantic relations. But I do think this statement which he made and which you quoted shows two things. One of them is obviously the domestic audience, but the second one is the European dimension of Germany's thinking about the consequences of a changing transatlantic relationship. Let me add a bit more flesh to that thought. First of all, I don't think anyone in the German foreign or security policy sphere would doubt at this time that transatlantic relations are crucially important for Germany. So with regards to your question, is there deep structural change? I would say at least on the German side, there is a continuous strategic interest to have close transatlantic relations. One area is obviously security and defense, and the necessary catch-up process that Europe still needs to do in that area and Germany needs to do is sort of the flip side of the coin, that transatlantic relations have been the defining framework of Germany's thinking about its own foreign security and defense policy. So the interest hasn't changed, but the recognition is there that Germany needs to play a bigger role. Secondly, the area of economics, and this panel is supposed to connect the two in some way. Now, from a German perspective, obviously trade ties are hugely important with the United States, but also beyond that question, which is, I think, most debated, there are big concerns about macroeconomic challenges and potential risks emanating in the United States that may spill into Europe. Here I'm thinking about the announced deregulation of the financial sector, the going back to maybe a state that is similar to the one before the 2007 crisis, and also combining this deregulation with a potentially more protectionist approach to having European financial actors in the US market is something that not only Germany but Europe is deeply concerned about. So that's sort of the economic package where I think it is in a very, very clear German interest and European interest to rather pursue cooperation than confrontation. Third point, I think there's a very deep recognition in Berlin how important the United States have been traditionally, but also in recent times, in building a strong Europe and in holding it together. Of course, if you look back at transatlantic relations, there have been moments of deep divide where US positions also divided Europeans, just to mention the Iraq War. But in particular, I guess the Obama years are seen with hindsight as possibly those that were most comfortable for Europe because there was a US president, although already changing on certain positions, but still committed to helping European leaders who decide to invest politically in the European project, back them. His statements on Brexit, which were totally the contrary to those of Donald Trump, are just an illustration of this point. Of course, also when it comes to EU foreign policy, the United States played behind the scene more than in front of the scene an important role in keeping Europe united on the sanctions issues vis-à-vis Russia and the Ukraine position. I think that shouldn't be neglected. Now, third point I'd like to make, obviously, is an issue of global order. And really, the discussions that immediately started in Berlin after the election of Donald Trump were about this precise question. How will the policies, unintendedly or intendedly, endanger the global order we have, and which Germany recognizes, as I think most Western partners, that needs to change anyway, but which is challenged through global power shifts, through fundamental technological change and other trends, but we still think this order needs to be maintained and developed. So what happens if the main builder and guarantor of this order, who used to do it in its very own national interest, suddenly says this is no longer the case? The German government, as you know, and you quoted Merkel, but I would say this applies to many more members of her government, take leadership on these issues. And I think the way at this point the transatlantic question intertwines with the European question in both the way policymakers talk about the challenges, but also the way they think about very concrete steps to move ahead, shows very clearly that both parameters, the transatlantic relationship and the prism of Europe, are so crucial for Germany's thinking about its own policy. So the reaction is, of course, to see what we can do in the European context. And this is both preparing for a worst-case scenario where what we see in the US is not just a temporary hiccup, but a structural moving away from that alliance and partnership which we used to have. But at the same time also, in my view, a very realistic understanding that in order to work with this administration, Europe needs to do this from a position of strength. So to be able, on a certain number of issues at least, to talk in a convincing way about its own interests and about the potential to cooperate with the United States. That applies to defense, foreign policy, particular, I mean, the numbers, NATO spending, defense spending, we can go into this, but also where I think we still lack a clear European initiative, a European view on the fight against terrorism, the way we want to stabilize the Middle East and Africa. Those are key issues. But also in terms of economics. And over the past 2-3 days, we have had a lot of debates about a possible revival of parts of TTIP or whatever. I think that Europeans have a huge task here to assess for themselves what is politically feasible in Europe these days, what is of interest to Europeans, and how to then approach this in a transatlantic context. So obviously Germany is in an interesting situation now. As I started with the elections, I'll go back to them. We don't know who will lead the country as of the fall, but what we can see is that all parties, and really all, that stand for election pay a lot of attention to foreign policy and security and defense issues. And for me, this is the continuation of a process through which Germany has worked on its own thinking, its own responsibility, its own strategy, both through its foreign policy review, its defense white book, and the current discussion on both, German defense policy, both in terms of spending, but more importantly, our readiness to participate in missions, to cooperate on armament in the EU context, to build a European pillar structure, whatever you want to call it, within NATO. And I think we are moving into the right direction here.
Thank you very much. We have a first point on the table to be discussed, if you wish, in the debate later on. How much strengthening Europe is the only way to save also the transatlantic relationship. I agree with that. It's important to underline that Macron, the new president of France, is clearly making a step forward Germany in that direction. We have important decisions in Europe concerning European defense, especially as far as the setting up of a new European fund for defense, investments, procurement, and the rest. And so this is one of the consequences, if you wish, unintended consequences, maybe, of the new situation across the Atlantic. But in any case, it's a new step forward, and we will have to follow that. But now I give the floor to Oksana Antonenko. She's a great expert on Russia. She's now visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science. The Russia factor is a very topical one in transatlantic relationship. On the one hand, it has become a sort of radioactive element in U.S. domestic politics, to say the least. On the other hand, my fear is that if we weaken too much the transatlantic relationship, the European Union could drift in the direction of Eurasia. So it's very important to keep a balance. And in general, Putin is taking advantages of all these divisions we have nowadays within the West. So it's very important to be able to treat the Russia factor in a proper way. And Oksana has very interesting ideas on how to do that. So please, Oksana, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Martha, for this very generous introduction. I'm not sure how many interesting ideas one can really express today in relations to Russia. I think, first of all, let me thank you and everyone at Aspen for including me in this fantastic group. It was, wonderful 3 days. I've learned a lot, and I hope that this dialogue will continue. So let me just, first of all, sort of give you a little bit of a history, which I think is quite important as we think about how we go, where we go from now. I mean, if we watch the news today in the United States, any channel you switch on, I think about 90% of time is dedicated to Russia issue. Not all of the debates perhaps are very sort of highly rational or interesting, but it is clear that it is a very, very important factor in the U.S. domestic politics. In Europe, if you switch on the TV sets, you will not see anything like that. On the other hand, we remember 2014, where the situation was completely opposite, when the Europeans have to contend for the first time, really since the end of the Second World War, with a situation where one country has annexed part of the neighboring country, and when the European security system, as we knew it, has really been challenged to its core. And for many Europeans, that was a defining moment, and particularly for the Europeans who've been living in this kind of zone of uncertainty and instability for many centuries in Eastern and Central Europe. And I think at that time, United States certainly came forward to reassure and support the Europeans in their time of need. And I think we have seen in many ways that the Ukraine crisis, the annexation of Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine has really brought the transatlantic security community together. We remember before that there was a pivot to Asia, there was a lot of debate about the future of NATO. I think once 2014 events happened, I think nobody had any doubts that NATO and the transatlantic community plays an absolutely crucial role. And we have seen a lot of very important steps taken since to reassure the allies, to really bring the credibility behind Article 5 with Wales summit of NATO, with many steps being taken on strengthening the resilience of the societies against propaganda and misinformation, and really many steps, important steps to support the reforms in Ukraine, to support Ukraine's aspirations for closer integration with the European Union and NATO. And we have seen, of course, just very recently, Ukraine finally receiving the visa-free status, which is a very important step forward in this process. But I think that sort of unity which was absolutely crucial. And of course, we also saw consensus on sanctions, which for the Europeans did not come very easy, I have to tell you. I mean, because unlike the Americans, who have very, I think, limited trade with Russia, many European countries, have had to make serious sacrifices. And I think here, Italy, Germany, and others, really have stepped to the fore very much, to a large extent, against the interest of their businesses and companies to really embrace the need to respond to what was happening at that time. But I think we now live in a different reality. I think this reality is now an important one. I think something which we should be proud of in the transatlantic context have really changed. It's changed for a number of reasons. One of them, of course, the elections in the United States. And I think the expectations that many of us had when we were listening to the statements coming out of the Trump campaign about the new Yalta-style deals, that, Trump potentially recognizing Crimea as part of Russia, and many other things which were said, luckily did not materialize. And in fact, in substance, we see very much a continuity of policies. The sanctions remain in place. There's still the reassurance steps within NATO continue. We see deployments of including American forces, but also other forces in Eastern Europe and Central Europe. But at the same time, I think the credibility of this, transatlantic sort of commitment to Article 5, commitment to defense within NATO is now being, if not eroding, but at least being more fuzzy after we have seen Trump not mentioning commitment to Article 5 in the recent meeting at NATO. And at the same time, we also see changes happening within Europe. In the last few months, I think the Europeans are increasingly starting to realize that not only that from the United States we are not going to see the kind of new reset with Russia, but that the poisonous domestic debate around the handling of the allegations about Russia's interference in the elections campaign by the administrations, which are now making really the U.S. administration in many ways incapable of managing relationship with Russia. I think it will be very interesting to observe in July what kind of meeting Trump and Putin are going to have. We have lots of important issues on the agenda, not least of them, important arms control agreements and important issues related to Syria and other parts of the world where the United States and Russia do have to discuss, whether they like it or not. It is part of a very important part of the bilateral agenda. But it is very unclear whether there is any capacity within the administration at the moment to really manage this relationship. And therefore, the Europeans are starting to think about whether they can lead on the relationship with Russia. For the Europeans, again, it doesn't come easy. And it doesn't come easy for a number of reasons. One of them is that the Europeans are always divided on Russia. I mean, this moment of unity, which came after the Crimean annexation of Crimea, was such a historic aberration in many ways. I mean, something which I'm sure will remain in the history books forever, the fact that the Europeans managed to bring together. But those divisions are now creeping in, and I think they're creeping in because there is no more clear understanding that there is a backing from the United States on the common policy. And at the same time, there are real interests that the Europeans have to have a dialogue with Russia, and not the least on their common neighborhood. Russia is very much involved in Syria these days, so that has direct implications for the migration crisis. Russia now becoming more and more involved in Libya, and I think we're probably likely to expect in the coming months even more substantial involvement there. We have a number of other important issues related to relationship between the EU and Russia, and therefore we've seen kind of quite a big restart of a political dialogue. We've seen for the first time in 2 years Angela Merkel visited Russia. Federica Mogherini, who is High Representative for Foreign Policy in Brussels in the European Union, for the first time since her appointment, paid a visit to Moscow. That was quite important, given that for the first time there was a consensus within the European Union member states that she was allowed to go, or could go to discuss important foreign policy priorities. And we, of course, seen President Macron choosing to invite President Putin as his first foreign policy hosting the first foreign leader after his elections, just within the days, and not only to invite him, but to roll a red carpet in Versailles with a very open kind of visit of that kind. And I think this is an indication of where things are going. I mean, I think we are going to see a much more serious effort from the Europeans to develop and articulate, their policy on Russia. And I think that will be very interesting to observe for the United States. And I hope that will also focus the minds here about the need, to think about what the transatlantic relationship vis-à-vis Russia in a situation where the Europeans are leading on that could look like. I think for us it's new. I don't think we have ever had that in the recent many decades. And then the second issue is to what extent some agenda items related particularly, I would say, to arms control, because I'm extremely concerned about the fact that we really need to go back to the 1960s, to the time when we had such a long pause in negotiations between Russia and the United States on important arms control agreements. The talks now have been frozen for almost 6 years, and it is about time to start discussing the new wave of strategic arms control, to really start discussing the issues related to conventional arms control and confidence-building measures. The INF Treaty, which is breathing probably the last breaths, really needs to be revitalized, because it is cornerstones, absolutely crucial for us to maintain strategic stability. And on all of these agenda items, it is the United States which has to lead, or at least has to be, substantially engaged in a very important way. So I think we are hoping that in addition to the United States continuing all of these positive issues related to the reassurance of Central and Eastern Europeans, supporting reforms in Ukraine, really putting forward more and more substantial and serious efforts. And here again, the Europeans have achieved a lot. For example, one can look at the election campaign in France of resisting and building resilience within society against, interference potential in the elections and misinformation. But apart from that, keeping that still there, we also need a serious way to think about how to engage with Russia on important issues which are the strategically important for both Europe and the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Oksana. Just to clarify, here in Washington, clearly Macron already met the Western leaders at the G7. Then, you rightly said, he met Putin in Paris, and he was very, very good, in a sense, because he was able to criticize Putin openly in front of the press against the kind of interference Putin made during the French electoral campaign. As you know, Marine Le Pen, the head of the Front National, was financed by a Russian bank very close to the Kremlin, so it was an important point in French domestic politics, and Macron was very good in taking an open position on that. It's an important and tricky issue in a sense, because the so-called populist parties in Europe are all more or less pro-Russians and much less pro-Americans. So we have a domestic twist, if you wish, on all that. It would be important to look at the Italian elections, by the way, because one of the main parties involved, the Five Star Movement, the populist party, is, I wouldn't say pro-Russian because it is too much, but in any case, more inclined to look to Russia in favorable terms and much less close to the United States as compared to the traditional political parties in Italy. But now I would like to switch to Andrea Montanino, a dear friend. He is working at the Atlantic Council on the economics. We had, during these days, a very interesting debate on TTIP, on the trade relationship between the U.S. and Europe. We started with the new Secretary of Commerce, with Burros, who came to our conference the other day at the Italian Embassy, and he was quite relaxed on TTIP. he said very clearly that while the U.S. has decided to let down the TPP with Asia, the same decision was not made on TTIP, so it was open enough over the possibility to start something new, more pragmatic in a sense, but again, a sort of TTIP light, TTIP 0.2 or something like that. Our Minister Calenda, the Minister for Trade in Italy, is equally interested in going into this direction. He made a speech to our conference, and today, a very interesting event organized by our friend Ivan Odoc at the Transatlantic Business Council, Stu Eisenstadt made some very interesting remarks over the possibility to sell a TTIP-like agreement to Trump's electorate. So the way in which we frame the TTIP issue is very important. We have to show that it will produce good results for American growth and jobs, which is the main objective of Mr. Trump. So please, Andrea, let's try to understand a bit better whether we really have a space for going into the direction of a new agreement between the U.S. and Europe on trade and investments.
Yeah. You know, Marta, what strikes me is that for 30 years, trade grew in the world basically 2 times GDP. So we had a huge growth of trade, and no one talked about trade. It was not a fancy topic, a sexy topic. Now that trade is going down, everybody talks about trade.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's becoming really the hot topic here in Washington and in Europe as well. My idea is that, I mean, trade and a trade agreement is just part of an overall strategy in order to allow our economies to grow more, to grow better, to be more inclusive. So one should, first of all, understand whether there is a real interest to strengthen transatlantic relation before saying we have space for going for a trade agreement with Europe. And therefore, I think it's important to find the right arguments. So how you explain the relevance of transatlantic relations to people, not just to people in Washington or in Brussels, but also those that live in small cities in northern Germany or in south of Italy, or that do not live along the 2 coasts here in the United States. And I think the best way to explain why transatlantic relations are important is money. Is talk about money, because that's what people care about. If we talk about money, what we see is that there is a huge economic interest in strengthening these relations. There are millions of jobs in the United States that rely on trade with Europe. There are millions of jobs that rely on investment by European companies in this country. And the other way around. There are a lot of jobs that in Europe relies on transatlantic relations. So just to provide some numbers in order to clarify. If we look at the stock of foreign direct investment, so not the annual flows, but the stock, the accumulated stock of the investment of American companies elsewhere in the world, you have the 41% of this stock is in the European Union countries. European Union, 27 countries, so taking away the UK. China is 1.5%, nothing. So anything that makes Europe stronger and then enhance this relation means more profits for American companies that invested in Europe, which means more jobs, more wealth, more income for American people. If you look on the other way around, again, the stock of investment in the United States, you see that 44% of all the investment in this country comes from EU 27 countries, Italy, France, Germany, Spain, etc. And again, creating jobs and creating income and growth. So one should explain that the more you deepen these relations, the more you make money elsewhere, not just in Washington. Investment is one component. The other component is, of course, trade, which is the largest recipient of goods and services from the United States, is EU 27 countries. If you look at the major recipient, Mexico, Canada, UK, and the EU is first. So there is a massive flow of exports from the United States that goes to Europe. And again, the more you have these relations, the better is for your pocket. So a trade agreement, in a way, can only help in building more these relations. Those that think that you can have investment without a trade agreement, well, I would not agree on that. If you are the BMW or you are Mercedes, that, by the way, are the two largest exporters of cars from this country, is not Ford, is not General Motors, you will not have plants here, factories here, unless you have free trade with Germany, because you have to buy intermediate goods from Germany to plug into your Mercedes and BMWs that are produced here and then exported elsewhere in the world. So you need a trade agreement. So I think we need, first of all, to find good arguments. People in Washington use too much the strategic argument when they explain the importance of TTIP, of a trade agreement with Europe. The strategic argument is, okay, Europe is the partner on sanctions, so you need to strengthen this partnership. Europe is the partner in global economic governance, which is true, and I fully believe on these things, but people don't understand.
Yeah.
Outside the Beltway, as we say here in Washington, no one understands these things. So my first suggestion, if we want to get into a trade agreement between Europe and the United States, bring examples that people can understand, which is money. So on your question, how this can be possible, whether this can be possible, I think Secretary Ross at the Italian embassy a couple of days ago said clearly that they are looking for an agreement with Europe. I mean, that was very, very clear. There is no, it's not the same attitude as with the TPP. The problem is which kind of trade agreement. Here we have a number of options to me on the table. The first one is to have a refocused pact. So something that is not the TTIP anymore, which was a comprehensive pact, maybe a pact on some topics that can benefit both the United States and Europe, and that can be reached in a relatively short period of time. Here you can have a negotiation that is sectoral, or you can have a negotiation which is across sectors. There are two different approaches. Sectoral means, okay, let's look at agriculture, let's look at cars, or whatever. Across sectors means, let's have a deal that helps small, medium enterprises. Let's have a deal that enhances e-commerce. Let's have a deal that allows better exchange of information. So a first choice is whether we want to go for a sector by sector or across sector. My preference is the second one, to go across. That can be more valuable. Then you have to decide whether you want to discuss on tariffs or non-tariff barriers. And here, again, if you look at tariffs, I mean, there's not much between Europe and United States. Tariffs are on average 2%. There are a few sectors where tariffs are very high. I was just looking at data. So, for instance, EU tariffs on processed foods are very high, 14.6%. Again, EU tariffs on motor vehicles are very high, so it's difficult for Americans to export cars. But apart from these two cases, there is not much. Whereas where there can be really an advantage is on non-tariff barriers. And here, barriers in the United States are usually higher than those in the European Union. But it's a difficult negotiation, but I would suggest to go in that direction. But again, make a smaller pact, focus on some topics and work on that. The other option that is probably the option that Secretary Ross and this administration has in mind is to go deal by deal on small things. I don't remember whether Ross mentioned the Italian embassy yesterday when he came to us at the Atlantic Council, but he made a clear example, which is the agreement they did with China on beef.
Yes.
He mentioned the embassy. So this is what they have in mind. And unfortunately, I don't think the Europeans will follow on this path. I don't see the European Union leaders giving a mandate to the European Commission to reach an agreement on beef or something like that with the United States. So bottom line, I close my first remarks. The road is very narrow. There are different views between Europe and the United States. There are so many options in front. I think we have to continue to make a case for a trade agreement, but we need to move fast. There are technical constraints. The first is that the TPA will expire in July 2018, and therefore the USTR will not have a mandate to negotiate unless the Congress will renew the authority to negotiate, and the Europeans need a new mandate. And I don't know whether someone is working on that in Europe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrea. Maybe a very small follow-up. The issue of the German trade surplus has become a sort of a paradigm of the problems we have at the economic level. How do you read it? Do you think it's just an instrumental issue, or is there something more? Can we reply in a way or another? What do you think?
Well, German companies invested in the United States 250 billion dollars, again, as a stock of foreign investment. These companies buy stuff from Germany. So they have to import in the United States in order to produce the goods. So part of the trade deficit with the United States, I think, is explained simply by this. I'd like to look into the data more in detail, but I'm curious to see how much BMW and Mercedes buy from Germany.
I can tell you, 66%.
Okay, so part of the answer is already there. So part of the trade deficit is here. The other part, to me, is simply because Germany is more competitive than United States. There is this index produced by the WTO and the United Nations Agency for Trade, which is called the Trade Performance Index, that take the commerce, the goods, takes trade, the goods traded in the world. It divided these goods in 14 categories, and it makes a ranking for each category of which country is more competitive, say. Among the 14 goods, on 8, Germany is first. Okay?
Okay.
I want to say, after Germany, the best is Italy. It's first in 3 out of 14, and it's second in other 5 or 6. United States, the best ranking is number 5 on food. And on the other 13 goods is on average at the 30th place, 30. So there is an issue of competitiveness in the United States. So simply the Germans are better. What do you want to say?
Okay. We will listen from Dan, whether you agree on that. I have a more general question to you, if you don't mind, as an opening remark. That is my question. The fundamental question is whether the American First doctrine is compatible with a real transatlantic alliance. I read with great interest the piece published in the Wall Street Journal by Gary Cohn and General McMaster, and I have to tell you that the real point, in my view, is that you blur the dividing line, if you wish, between allies and rival powers if you decide that everything depends on the just return for the United States. So I would like to listen from you. I'm really, in a sense, I'm worried because the way in which it was explained by two very reasonable members and very authoritative members of the administration was rather worrying, in my view. Please.
Well, thank you. Thank you for everyone for coming, and I'm put in the position of sort of then representing at least an American view on many of these topics. Let me go through them. Let me just say, Marta, the simple thing is America first, not being America alone. The next day, the president withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement after that article was written. So It is pretty much America alone. America first is a lonely strategy, and it's also an expensive strategy in the end. There will be no America first without Europe, just to put my cards on the table. But frankly, to my European friends, there's never going to be a Europe whole, free, and at peace without the United States. So I think we have to confront that. And then step back and see what has happened to us. So a few points. We used to have a partnership in which we would consult together about other unpredictable countries or crises. Today, we have become the unpredictable ones. And I think we need to understand that. I'm sorry, is there someone out there? Okay. And I think the other thing we need to think about is we don't understand very well the domestic roots of our respective foreign policies. And most Americans will admit they don't understand a lot of the domestic politics of Europe. But I think many Europeans do think they understand America, especially European elites. And then they're surprised when we elect people that don't correspond to their view of what the United States is. So I think, there's a good research agenda there, frankly, to understand the domestic roots of foreign policy on both sides of the Atlantic, and particularly, if I may suggest, Europeans to understand American society better than they do. American studies in Europe is a branch of British literature, and it is not treated actually as a serious sort of, subject of analysis. And you shouldn't be surprised sometimes when you're surprised by this. We have lots of currents in there, what I and many others are calling a Jacksonian foreign policy. Europeans need to understand what that means, and I don't think many do. So we're starting from a gap, really, in understanding that we have to fix. But we're facing some common issues on both sides of the Atlantic. I would say that, the old paradigm on the domestic side, on both the United States and Europe, between right and left, has really shifted to a new debate between open and closed. And that those who argue we should embrace the open society, reap the benefits of globalization, they're on the defensive against those who say we have to shield our societies from these disruptive forces, we have to protect them, we have to make sure that if we engage in the world, we have to, not disrupt our own values or our own traditions at home. That is the dividing line, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic now, and because you see, right and left coming together on some interesting positions. You see, back to domestic roots on the U.S., Trump and Obama had similar messages in some areas about the relationship with the United States and the rest of the world. And we'll have to understand why that would be, not get locked into some, other normal stereotypes. So, my basic point on the United States would be we're going to live for the rest of the Trump presidency with a tension between, this is like an English language wordplay, between temperament and temperance. Okay, the president is temperamental. He shoots off his policy in a tweet, or he decides from one day to the next what he's going to do. Even his advisors, as we see, can't really know on a given day where they're headed. But we have also seen that our system of checks and balances is tempering that impulse. So, temperance and temperament, or instinct and institutions,
Yeah.
is the tension of the United States for the next number of years. We all going to live with that, everyone. So I think we just have to put that as the frame. I can come back to it if you want. But, I have to say, we are focused, when I'm just in Europe so often, everyone's so focused on what's happening here and the mess in Washington and the United States. But I've got to tell you, when you sit in Washington and you look across the Atlantic the other direction, it's the same conversation. Europe is a mess. And many Americans are saying, my God, what has happened to them? Why can't they get their act together? They're breaking apart. It is the same conversation. And if we think it's only a one-way conversation about one side of the Atlantic being the mess, we're not going to fix anything, because we're having the same conversation about each other and not with each other too much. So let's be careful about sort of just looking one direction about where the problems are, because if you look at what is happening in Europe, it is a confluence of crises that are really challenging fundamental concepts of sort of the European experiment. And it's unclear how our European friends are going to really deal with this in any way. And it's a very inner-directed, very inner debate at the moment. That worries Americans who think Europe needs to play a more outward-looking debate, and I think reflects those domestic politics that I mentioned. So just to take on a few of these points, Angela Merkel did not declare a generational shift in German foreign policy in a beer tent. If she had chosen to do that, she would have done it somewhere else, and she would have said it in a much more fundamental way. That's who she is. It was domestic politics in many ways, because she stole two themes from the SPD in one phrase. The SPD, is going to put her on the defensive through this campaign of being a poodle of Donald Trump, because they're not going to be. You can see that. So she is under pressure to stand up to Trump because of the domestic electoral. She's not going to gain a vote by saying, I think Donald Trump is doing the right thing. So by that one phrase, she stole that theme from the SPD. And the second is they have as their leader the former president of the European Parliament, who's a pro-European social democrat. She cannot be, given the nature of the changes now, of the political dynamic in Europe, it's good to be pro-Europe at the moment. And she has to be equally pro-Europe as Martin Schulz, president of the European Parliament. So at the same time, she steals the second theme away from the SPD by saying we Europeans have to start to do this better together. So I think that was very smart, and I think it helped her domestically. The key was not the first sentence she said, it was the next sentence. She said we have to take our destiny and really take our destiny in our own hands. I've experienced that the last 2 days, is what she said. That was the personal point about Donald Trump. And there, I think she, reflected that. But that's not a, sea change in German foreign policy. It's just a reality of the temperance issue. So I agree with Daniela, the structural links are all still there. And frankly, if Americans looked at her sentence, Europeans really have to take their destiny more into their own hands, we would cheer that. We are the ones who want you to take your destiny more in your own hands. What's the problem? Please do it. There is a huge support in the United States for Europe being able to be capable of taking its destiny into its own hands. Please. And so, there is just not a... I'm sorry. Thank you. Okay. It sounded like you were going to jump out of your chair. And just to, it's the kind of Europe that Europe wants to build that would be important to Americans. That's always been the question. Europeans always say to the Americans, do you want a strong Europe or not? Well, you have to say, well, what do you mean by a strong Europe? Because it's a continuing debate among the Europeans. So why do Americans have a view that the Europeans don't have any view on what they mean by a strong Europe? Do you mean a strong Europe of Margaret Thatcher or Charles de Gaulle? Do you mean the Europe of Václav Havel or Václav Klaus? Is it the strong Europe of Angela Merkel, or is it Viktor Orban? Which Europe, please? The Americans are not going to decide that. It's a European debate, and we will be part of it, but we're not going to decide it. So we will see how this goes, and I think it was a little blown out of proportion in terms of what this was about, and we would welcome, I think, Europeans being able to be capable of mastering all those challenges that we mentioned. The second, I think, was on just thinking about Europe. And back to the inward looking. Mr. Juncker published a document a few months ago called The Future of Europe. That was the title of the document. Future of Europe. There is not one word in that document about millions of Europeans who are not part of the European Union. Not one word. 5 options of the future of Europe. None of those options mention anybody who's not in the EU. And there is a tendency within EU land, if I may say, to equate the EU with Europe. I heard it actually all this morning. And it's just not true. And in fact, it's becoming less true because a big member of the European Union is about to leave it, whose GDP is equivalent of 21 other EU countries. So we have to, and I think this is a reflective of this inward nature. It was such an inward-looking document. It said nothing about the future of Europe, and yet everyone's still debating it within EU land as if that's the choices we have. Those are not the choices we have. And my concern on this inward-looking on both sides of the Atlantic is that we are ignoring, in fact, those millions and millions of other Europeans. And if we cannot understand how they need to be part of this larger dynamic, we will end up paying a much higher price later, because we have always done that when we've ignored the other parts of Europe. I believe, firmly, and many are here, that when East Europeans, Central East Europeans, in 1989 said, we want to rejoin Europe, that is the revolution that's still shaking that continent. We need to understand what it means. But rejoining Europe today is not enough, I have to say to those colleagues who are on the streets. It's a passive, now it's become a passive slogan. You rejoin Europe to escape history? Well, history is still around. And we have to understand the nature of Central Europe and this growing gray zone to the east of the EU that is violent, it's very turbulent, it is uncertain where its future will be. People there don't know where their future lies. We haven't done a very good job in either parts of the transatlantic world helping them understand that. There are many problems, I get it. But we have to face a perspective that the paradigm we had, the 25-year paradigm after the Cold War, has ended. And we do not have a new paradigm, especially for those people, because the enlargement paradigm is not there. Mr. Juncker has said, under his term, no enlargement. I'm sure the next European Commission will say the same thing. The United States is not particularly in that mode right now. A country like Montenegro joining NATO is fine, but it's the exception. So we do not have a concept, as we did, for the next generation. And we need to think very hard, what is the concept we have for those people? If it's not enlargement per se, my view is we have to be much more tailored, we have to be much more focused, and I do believe, and Natalie is here, and I hope she would say something, is, the nature of Ukraine in the end will help determine the nature of Europe. We have to understand that. That's a country, 50 million people in the heart of Europe. How it goes will be decisive. We have to understand the strategic stakes we both have in that. Rather than worry about the distractions of the peripheries of Europe, we have to understand how the heart of Europe is going to be shaped, which leads to Russia. And, Donald Trump had 3 priorities during his election campaign. Foreign policy, only 3. He said, we're going to build a wall, we're going to chase the terrorists and decimate them, and China's a problem. That was it. He talked about Russia like, can't we get along? Wouldn't it be nice if we got along? But it was not a priority, and given the investigations, everything that's happening, it's less of a strategic priority. But I think it's important to understand that when he says it wouldn't be nice to get along, he's thinking of Russia as a function of these other priorities, not as a priority unto itself. Because the basic view in the United States, as I believe in Europe, is Russia is a declining power. and in China. It's just that we take different lessons from that insight. In Europe, the notion of Russia's declining power is dangerous. In the United States, Russia's declining power is, well, okay. And in China, it's an opportunity. And so I think we have to think harder about the Russia as a function of other priorities rather than Russia as a priority, that's how I think this administration will approach it. So there's not a big agenda there. It would be nice to have the Russians help us with terrorism. The fact that we don't agree what a terrorist is might complicate that. It would be nice to have the Russians help us with Iran or North Korea or China. The idea that Russia will break its ties to Iran because of this niceness is not going to happen. It might help us on North Korea, but the idea that Russia is going to be that influential with China, questionable. In fact, what's happened since the election is that actually it's the U.S.-Chinese relationship that's now turning into something not what people thought, but maybe actually a pretty good deal for both sides as they're trying to work this out. There's a 100-day deal going on in which we look at the trade relationship if the Chinese help on North Korea. The Chinese say, well, you overestimate how influential we are on North Korea, and the Trump people say, well, that's the test. Let's see. And the fact that they did, in fact, announce this U.S.-Chinese set of economic things, it was quite significant. People said, well, that was just a collection of old things, but the administration made a political choice to make that as a positive forward statement. That in itself is an important signal of a shift in how approaching China. I'm not going to say it's been easy, a lot of tensions, but there is a different approach they're taking to China than they had in the past. And so there are a few set priorities of this administration that are pretty clear, but there are, in almost every other area, the administration is not looking to engage more. Jacksonian foreign policy is trying to shed burdens, not share them. It is trying to put off on others burdens of doing things that the United States, in their view, shouldn't be involved in. So if you think the 2% demand is a big thing, consider that we are cutting a great deal of our humanitarian assistance. We're cutting a great deal of our development assistance. We are stopping huge amounts of payments to the United Nations. In all of those areas, there's a vacuum emerging, and the question will be who's going to step into it. And that's much more than 2% in terms of budgetary implications, especially for Europe. And the question is Europe capable, willing to step up in these areas? Because what you're going to see is this dichotomy between the United States that is fierce on its clear priorities, no compromise, and then it abandons the field on a whole set of other ones. And that's the kind of the United States you're going to see. That's what a Jacksonian foreign policy really implies for others. So let me come to the trade and economic issues. I'm happy to hear our statistics quoted. In the back is our annual report on the Transatlantic economy that does all the trade, jobs, and investment between each of the 50 states and the EU, and all of your U.S. source jobs and trade investment and jobs in each of the EU 28 countries, plus Norway, Switzerland, and Turkey. We have just released a new study with the same sort of data called the Transatlantic digital economy, because the digital economy is now becoming the economy in many ways. And the interesting thing about it is there's no good data about data. So we have tried to create new metrics of the transatlantic digital links that now create a way to understand why this is so important and how we're tied together in the digital world. If you put those things together, then you see, as you said, why it's so important to stick together. But you also see it's not about trade. Trade is important, but the relation is driven by investment. The investment flows are really what matter. You know, German exports to the United States are 1/5 German investment in the United States. And Germany still thinks it's a trading power. It's actually more important in the world as an investment power than a trading power. But that hasn't even sunk through in Germany. So if you start to focus, one issue is about the trade deficits. The administration is very fixated on this notion, but they almost always confine themselves, or the president does, to goods trade. But services is equally, if not more important to all of our economies, and there the U.S. has a trade surplus with all of Europe. It's not the same as the trade deficit, not as big, but it's significant. And the trade deficit with Germany has been declining over the last few years, so it went down 10 billion last year. So the trajectory is actually the other way. And what our digital study shows is that the U.S. has a huge surplus in what is called digitally enabled services. That is a huge strength of the United States. So when you think about competitiveness, if you link a scale of competitiveness to goods, it's not going to show the U.S. very competitive. But if you show, competitiveness across the economy, the U.S. absolutely is world-class competitive in the digital economy. In fact, the debate in Europe is maybe too competitive for Europe. But the point on the digital trade is, and digitally enabled services, is that we have a big surplus with Europe in that, and that our trade surplus with Europe, and that is double our trade surplus with the entire Asia-Pacific region in these products. And it's just it's a different story when you put all this together in terms of the economic exchanges across the Atlantic. So in terms of more of the politics of this year, I believe, will be a year of damage limitation or explosions if we don't limit the damage. And on both sides of the Atlantic, not just on one side of the Atlantic, there are real issues coming our way. Europeans are concerned about our the legislative agenda of the Trump administration in the economic area. Infrastructure bill, border tax adjustment, border tax reform, all these kinds of things. I would argue, given the polarization that's going on, we are likely to see none of those happen. Donald Trump is not a Republican. He has captured a party in the United States. He does not have the contacts on Capitol Hill, nor does he show the capacity to build the kind of coalitions that will be necessary to get these things done. Even on health care, they failed once. They got it through the House of Representatives. It's going to be stuck in the Senate. Not going to happen. So what we are seeing is more back to the polarization we have seen before on our legislative agenda, where almost nothing really is going to get passed. So I think you can take a deep breath in a way from our European side, but it's not a good story. But I don't see huge coalitions coming around. On infrastructure, the Democrats have been the ones that wanted the big infrastructure bill, and he is supporting that. And a lot of Republicans might go along with it, but the budget hawks in the Republican Party absolutely will not. And it's just really unclear whether you're going to have enough votes to really get that through. If it does go through, then we'll back to damage limitation. It's all about Buy American. Hugely popular here if the infrastructure goes through, because that'll be what the story will be. And then the EU will challenge the U.S. because that's illegal before the WTO, and then the question will be, does the U.S. just leave the WTO? I don't think we'll get that far because of all these other issues, but I think these are kinds of, and when I say damage limitation, we have to preempt that type of thing. The same on this trade deficit debate. I think one could start over time to make a better case. I'm surprised how badly, if I may say, my German colleagues are doing at making this case. They seem so surprised by it and dismissive of it, they don't actually just make the case. And I think you could do a much better job showing all this whole range of data on why this is important to American workers, as you said, making a case to people why their jobs depending on this. So those are clear things coming from the U.S. side. But let me say there are a couple things coming from the European side. One is, I believe the issue that's going to blow a lot of this up, unless we manage it, is the privacy debate. Privacy.
Yeah.
We have the U.S.-EU Privacy Shield. It was renegotiated after the one before it had been, deemed inadequate on the European side. It took a long time again. We have about 3,000 companies now part of this Privacy Shield. It's under court challenge in Europe. It's uncertain whether it will pass a review that the Commission has to conduct now. And on the U.S. side, there are a number of legislative things that have to happen this year, given our national security type of legislation with the privacy issues. That is the one, I think, that really has to be watched and managed with great care, because if you don't manage that, then it chills the rest of the economy, because we would not have a framework for data flows. And yet again, we would show we are incapable of figuring this out. So I think that one is a real challenge, and I think it'll come from the European side. The second is about China. we are supposed to have recognized China as a market economy under the WTO. Neither one of us has. And so China's taken the EU before the WTO, in my view, trying to pick off the weaker partner. And I've been in Europe. I must say I get mixed messages on this. Many will say absolutely not. The EU is going to stick to its guns. The Chinese are not a market economy, and we're not going to change. Others are saying, it's time that we change this. I could just have to say, if there was an EU decision without consultation with the United States to recognize China as a market economy, that would be a huge explosion across the Atlantic. It would be the neutron bomb decision in reverse, if anybody understands that context. So I'm not saying it's happening, but I've heard enough now to make me wonder whether, in fact, there's more of a European debate on this than I had thought, but it would not be good. And so simply pointing to Trump as the source of all evil, I think this does not represent some of the issues the real issues we have to deal with. So what do we do? I think on the economic side, I share my colleagues' view that we project forward, but one has to think now about the context again. The Europe in which we would have a U.S.-European economic arrangement is not the Europe in which we started a TTIP negotiation. We have to think about that Europe and not the old Europe. And so it's not going to be called TTIP. Couldn't possibly be called TTIP to get any traction in Europe, I think. It can't be TTIP light because that just seems like a repackaging, which again would not survive in Europe. And Europe is not the EU. You're going to have a major economy join non-EU Europe. And we have a new transatlantic triangle that's developed that we have to think very hard about. There is a EU-UK negotiation in which the United States has a fundamental stake that goes well. There will be a temptation, however, by the administration to take sides. There is a U.S.-UK negotiation that's actually already started, if anyone's paying attention, a shadow negotiation about a bilateral, economic relationship. It's already started. Again, the point is moot. Again, from an EU point of view, you can't do that. Well, they're doing it. So they're not calling it a negotiation, but they'll be ready far quicker than the EU and UK will be on some of these things, but they will wait until the right time. And the EU must have a fundamental interest that goes well. And then there is the US-EU piece, which again, we have to think harder about how that will look. But when I say I say non-EU Europe, from a U.S. economic point of view, non-EU Europe is a significant entity. It is, from a U.S. commercial interest, it is significant. It's not something that's just appendage. And I think the Europe we're facing would be better to think of a map of the value chains of Europe rather than the institutional connections. If you see how linked Turkey is into all of these value chains and networks, how Switzerland is involved, how, of course, the UK, Norway, you will see a different map of Europe if seen from a U.S. commercial point of view. And we have to think harder about what that might mean. So I would put the U.S.-EU bilateral framework in this different context. And so we talk about jobs and growth. I'm talking more about a North Atlantic initiative for jobs and growth that has various tracks, of which US-EU is one, important, probably the most important, but it's not the only one. I think that does resonate more with the Trump folks because that's how they think. But I think we all have to understand it's in our common interest to make all of that work. So that means, back to just the last point on US-EU, in my view, you have to make this not a corporatist, seen as a corporatist agenda. I would drop the ISDS. I don't believe that has any future in any US-EU agreement, particularly because the European Court of Justice just made a pretty profound decision that means anything that involves investment has to have approval of 38 European parliaments. It's not going to happen. And we have strong rule of law on both sides of the Atlantic, and that was a huge opposition point in Europe. And we don't really need it if we want to make some progress. So I would drop it. I would, as I say, make it more inclusive, more transparent. The EU Commission changed its whole approach to trade because of opposition to TTIP before, but the U.S. did not. USTR still approaches trade negotiations as it did before. It's sort of a closed types of concept. That'll be tough to change, but I think given the politics in the United States, you're going to have to do that. And then you break it down into these pieces that was said. It's interesting that on the TTIP negotiation, the area that got probably the most traction was regulatory issues. We always thought that would be the toughest one. But in a whole range of areas, the regulatory agencies have come together on good practice or ways to have mutual recognition or deem essential equivalence, lots of different kinds of things. I would say let them just go do that. Don't make it part of an agreement. Just let them do it. Whether it's sectoral then or whatever, you just let them do it. It'll be under the radar screen, but it'll make progress. And we could sign about 5 agreements right now because they actually already did them. But because they're held up because of the framework. So I'm sorry, I just had to respond to so many different European points to make sure that it's a framework. And so I would piece it apart. I would think harder about what we really want in the US-EU framework. Trade tariffs are small, but the economies are so big that a 3% reduction in tariffs really means something. So trade is still an important thing. It's just not the driver of our economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. I think it really was very, very useful, even if a bit controversial for me, first of all, but I would like to...
That's why you came.
Yeah, this is why we came, and I have to tell you that this description of American priorities was very well taken. Thanks a lot. It allows us to understand a bit better. Your judgments on Europe, in my view, are not all shareable, but we can discuss that. I would like to give the floor to some of you. Natalie, are you willing to intervene? Because Dan was eager to listen to you.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. After 3 days of discussing the transatlantic relationship, I find it very hard to even come up with something to say. I'm depressed. I'm depressed by it. As an American who grew up and then moved and is now a European as well, you know, I find that this Jacksonian foreign policy that you describe doesn't take into account the lessons learned over the last few hundred years. And that the exit...
I'm not arguing for it. I'm just
saying, but even if there are 3 top priorities that you mentioned, to accomplish those 3 top priorities, the transatlantic unity, transatlantic alliance is absolutely necessary. The vacuum that's created, you know, we're looking at what's happening in Qatar today. The vacuum that's created if the United States doesn't play that role cannot immediately be filled by Federica Mogherini tomorrow. It just can't. And so when we talk about these things, and even when you talk about why the United States has become this way, or the way Stu Eisensat described in the last session, that, you know, there is a deep problem in those who have won and lost, let's say, from globalization, from open trade, and from technology. That problem is the same in Europe as it is in the United States. And so we still share enormous values. We still share the same problems. And instead of working together to resolve them, because we have the same problems, to separate ourselves and to go America first or France first or whatever it turns out, is not going to help us get through these problems. And so I find this discussion, now looking at it from Ukraine, is very, very depressing, because you can't walk away from those values and then accomplish the priorities or resolve the problems that created this situation. So I think it's very short-sighted, and I don't know how you respond to it. And the advice about looking for small pieces to kind of bring ourselves back together, I think it avoids the necessary conversation, which is that we still share the same values. We have the same problems. The resolutions are going to be harder to find if we do it alone. And picking off small deals, whether it be, you know, beef or chicken, it's not going to resolve the problems, and it's not going to put us in any better place. So for me, these 3 days have just been a shocking eye-opener to how difficult this is going to be and how dangerous the vacuum is going to be for all of us.
Thank you very much. I collect three questions or comments from the floor, 4, and then I'm sorry because we're running against time as usual. Gianni Riotta, Federica, and Ivan, and then the 2 young students, scholars.
I thought I was the young.
Professors, I don't know. The young one.
Are you referring to me? Thank you.
The
You see,
boy
it was really
before,
worth it.
The boy before.
I very much appreciated Professor Hamilton's intervention because I love when you said you cannot pick up American democracy, I like it or not, and you should do European better work about understanding American society. That is not just what shows up on a Washington think tank. And I loved it because this is what I preach to American kids every day when they are critical of the president. It's like, well, these are 43 million people voting for him, and you should at least meet them since you're not meet them in Ivy League. But I also loved when you said temperamental and temperate. But I think that where I'm skeptical about the new round of negotiation is because the temperamental is strategic. And I beg to differ on if on Merkel, if it's just for domestic intention or for strategic intention, because I think that our American friends, I live literally 2 weeks and 2 weeks in Europe and the United States, our American friends are underestimating the damage that the president is doing with his temperament, because May is desperate in need to have a special relationship. I'm done, Martha. Desperate in need of having a special relationship with Trump, but tweeting hatred on Mayor Sadiq Khan. Trump alienated millions of British citizens that are more bound to be pro-American. So I wish luck to anybody that has to negotiate complex issues like you do, because after 4 months of negotiation, the president will wake up and tweet something and your work will go for naught. Thank you.
Philip.
Yeah, on a similar line, thank you again for stimulating yet another stimulating panel. But on a couple of things. On when you say then Europeans, if you want to go further, be my guest, we would be the happiest. No, the U.S. administration for a few decades was not happy about EU political integration. It was not happy when the single market came about. It was not happy when the euro came about. All the talks that it would collapse, and oops, guess what? It didn't. So no, this is counterfactual. For a first time, the Europeans might be able to do it. Now, it remains to be seen whether we'll do it or not, but is counterfactual. On American institutions, I think I share what Gianni said. The damage of this presidency will be long-lasting to the U.S. and to transatlantic relations. 4 years like this, we might never recover. I think we live too much in the moment. You know, I think it's 124 years ago, Gandhi was kicked out of a train in South Africa because he refused to sit in first class. And one man brought the British Empire on its knees. And it took over a century for Britain, for the UK, to understand that the empire was over. And I think we are at a similarly momentous moment here. The American leadership is finishing. I don't think we are realizing it. And Russia, it might be weak, but this is not the perception around the world.
This is my perception in any case. Ivan.
Thank you very much. A few quick comments. First of all, you mentioned, Daniel, ISDS. You can't have a trade agreement without ISDS. The business community will not accept it. It's there since 1959 in the German-Pakistan agreement, and it's basically a non-starter. I don't know how you want to negotiate an agreement with EU and non-EU Europe. It might be a tough one. It just doesn't work. I like your idea, your comparison between Havel and Europe of Havel and Europe of Klaus and Europe of Merkel, Europe of Orban. That's the way we sometimes think about it. I will have no comments on the Juncker's plan. But I cannot, it's written there, plan for Europe. Obviously, it's for the EU. You are also using sometimes the term of Europe. You mean EU, and sometimes you mean Europe. So it's a question of semantics, and you are doing exactly the same. Now, a very concrete thing, what Daniel, what Andrea, you have said on the TTIP. Light TTIP or just eliminating tariffs, it's not in the interest of the business community. The industry will not do it. We wanted to have a comprehensive agreement. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So if the politicians and if the academics will start again and say, let's have a light TTIP, between light or TTIP or whatever agreement between the EU and US, we will just eliminate the tariffs and then we forget it, and we will have no regulatory convergence and no elimination of non-tariff barriers to trade. The industry is not interested, and you cannot do it without the industry. We have seen it in many agreements. So I wonder how this is going to end. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. Excuse me. Brett Fortnam. I'm a journalist with Inside U.S. Trade. A question to the panel, if I may. We've had several years of negotiations with TTIP, and now the acronym is coming back after the September EU trade ministers meeting. Commissioner Malmström has called it, has said it's in the freezer, and Secretary Ross is now just starting to come around to using the acronym himself. But with all this talk of incremental deals and a possible relaunch of trade talks, what happens to all of the negotiation that's already been done? Is this administration just going to tear it up? I think before Obama left office, there was a plan in place, but we have chapters and chapters of text. Is that a starting point for new talks, or is that text going to be looked at again?
Thank you very much. The last two, Michael Zontowski and Mr. Ritz.
Well, thank you. Well, Dan, what troubles me is that I think you put a brilliant conceptual framework on something that I'm not quite sure deserves it. This is a typical academic approach. I don't, in reality, I think Jackson would turn in his grave if this was called Jacksonian foreign policy. I mean, I think there were parts of the Jacksonian foreign policy about sharing the values and supporting our friends, but not becoming directly involved in their fights and in their conflicts, and that's has a long tradition. But this is not what I see here. What I see is I'm sorry to say, is madness. And if there's, as Shakespeare said, if there's method to it, I fail to see it.
The last one, please. Yeah, and then we close.
Good afternoon. My name is Frida Dangler. I'm a recent graduate of the American University. And I have a question to the panel. So I'm obviously encouraged about the support here for transatlantic trade. I have a problem, though, with the focus. Lots of you mentioned only the American side. You said you need to focus on selling it to the people that live beyond the Beltway. I think it's equally important to sell it to the people beyond the city of London and the city of Frankfurt, because there was also a huge obstacle in the TTIP negotiations. And what would that message be? Would it be the same as the one we project to the American voters, or would it be different? And yeah, after all, what would it be? Thank you.
Thank you. Very right. Please, very short, if you
Right,
can.
thank you. Fanny Deleville, trade attaché at the Embassy of France. I was wondering, given the uncertainty at the administration level in the U.S., whether and how we could engage with other stakeholders more directly in the U.S., such as at the state level, local level, even companies or Congress more directly, which we haven't necessarily done as much, especially on trade and investment matters. Thank you.
Thank you. I will give 2 minutes each to our speaker. I'm sorry for that. We all must go back to this terrible Europe you have been describing. Please, Daniela.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. I'll pick up the question on selling TTIP or whatever we call it in Europe. I think you're exactly right. I mean, Germany was probably the country where the leaders were most surprised by public opinion suddenly turning against free trade. I mean, there was a lot in the reasons and in the discussions. We shouldn't forget that all of this happened just after the NSA affair years. So there was distrust in Americans. There was surely some well-organized anti-American propaganda movement going on. But there were also substantive issues on trade itself, on the dispute settlement system. And then third strain of the discussion was distrust in the European Commission and this whole transparency issue, disclosing the mandate and so on. So I think there has to be a specific message to Europeans, which cannot be the same as to the US audience. It needs to be about why this is good for us, why it is not undemocratic, why it actually strengthens Europe. There was a lot of sentiment in the European discussion that we are actually negotiating from a position of weakness because we were not as quickly recovering from the crisis years as the US did, so that also played in. So it needs to be a position of this is in our interest, it makes us stronger, and we are not in a very bad position. I mean, we are weaker than the US, but on recovery course. And I think it has to be embedded in a broader European narrative on where we are taking the European Union, and that this EU has to be one which is strong and open to the world and not the opposite. So
Thank you. Oksana?
Well, I just wanted to ask Mr. Hamilton about the, whether Russia is weak or strong. I mean, it is obviously very weak in the objective criteria, and in terms of its economy is now barely the size of Netherlands. But at the same time, I think oftentimes in foreign policy, the weakness and strength is measured by the willingness to use your power as opposed to what kind of objective power you have. And we have seen both in Syria, now increasingly in Libya, in Afghanistan nowadays, and of course, most of all in Ukraine, that Russia in a pretty weak situation is prepared to project its power, and that concerns a lot of very important interests that the Europeans have. And certainly, I would argue, also important American interests. And therefore, I think just a policy which would say, well, it is really not our priority, would not do, because we do have a number of important arms control agreements expiring very soon, something which the United States should take seriously.
Thanks.
Very quickly on the TTIP, of course, we need to have an agreement on regulation. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense, and that's the reason why I think it's better to work on across sectors rather than on sector by sector, because then you can concentrate on regulation. But let me conclude with one word. I think we have a big problem, and the big problem is that we don't understand each other. That's the fundamental question now on transatlantic relation, how we can start understanding. And one of the reasons why we don't understand each other is because we don't understand ourselves. So what is Europe? Europe is going towards more integration or not? We don't know, we Europeans. So it's difficult for the Americans to understand what's going on in Europe. And on the other side, is this country going towards isolation, or it's still a country of inclusiveness? They don't know, the Americans, so it's difficult for us Europeans to understand. So that's the situation to me, and I think this kind of community should continue to work in building bridges and try to explain what is at the basis of the transatlantic relations.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Michael, I agree with you. I was just trying to explain the context. I think if we get lost in the fact that we're dealing with a crazy person, and that's the end of the analysis, that doesn't get us too far. So in terms of alienation, he's not only alienating big sections of other countries, he's alienating, read the front page of the Washington Post. he argued that pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, he's representing Pittsburgh, not Paris. Well, people in Pittsburgh are completely at arms now by being referenced that way, because Pittsburgh is not what you think. It has changed its whole economy. It's a very different place. So, talk about alienation. This is the nature of the debate we are having in this country, and I come back to my tension. That's the tension we're going to live with. So I'd rather talk about how we deal with that reality rather than just sort of, dismiss each side. So, and you can be practical. I think the last suggestion is exactly right. Let's stick with climate change. California is much more relevant to climate change and to how we deal with standards and all sorts of things than Washington, just because of the nature of our system. And, to engage American society in these issues is much more of a productive strategy for Europeans and others to spend your time waiting for somebody to be appointed to some job in Washington. I mean, this is what holds our relationship together are the links between our societies. It's much deeper than whoever is coursing through the White House in a given cycle.
Absolutely.
And thinking about our relationship as that relationship opens up all sorts of other avenues. I worked for a time actually for at the time Foreign Minister Steinmeier in his office in his first round, and that was with George W. Bush, and the same climate change issue. Well, what happened? Germany approached the states of the United States. There was a climate action program that had full engagement with U.S. partners, but it just wasn't the people in Washington, D.C. I think those types of things are really good. Talk about our challenge right now is how you link our education system to our economic system. We don't do that well. There are really good models in Europe of how you could do that. Americans want to know about that. American governors want to know about that because that's where the competency is. Whoever is the Secretary of Education is irrelevant to that discussion. So rather get hung up on who Betsy DeVos is, you should go see the governor of North Carolina. I mean, that's where European leaders should go. Yes. Don't come here. Go other places. It's just the important thing. And meet in other places so you understand that dynamic better than meeting on the East Coast. Last point on Russia, if I could. Simply, I have to say, Federica, it's counterfactual what you said. The U.S. never knows how to deal with European integration. At an abstract level, we say usually, as the U.S. government, we like it. But when the Europeans make a decision on a certain kind of integration, the U.S. looks to its interests. So it's kind of a wave. You can always see this. They create the single market. The cottage industry of think tanks and everybody say, oh my God, what does this mean for us? Is this a protectionism? Is this it? And yes, so there's a wave about that. But in the end, we say, it's okay. And we do better than anybody else with a big continental single market. So the U.S. likes that now. Same with the euro. There was a big debate. What's the euro mean for the dollar? We didn't know. But now, hey, okay. There's still a debate about it because there's still a debate in Europe about it. But it's not the U.S. opposing it. If you think the U.S. would oppose European integration through the disaggregation strategies we've seen in the past, I got to tell you, it's really easy to do. And at the moment, the Trump people have refrained from that, but they could easily not. And if you think you have a problem now, we just wait till that happens, because that would be a real turn in U.S. approach. So they're not doing it yet. On Russia, I was just trying to describe what I think the perception. It's not my approach at all. I think Russia is, significant, but it's seen more as a spoiler these days than as something, as a superpower in its own right. That is not the perception of Vladimir Putin, of course. He wants to be seen only at this same level. And so, if you ask me, what do I think? We have to hold Russia to account on violations of basic standards of international order that it has conducted the last few years, and we have to stick to that. We have to, at the same time, engage the Russians in exactly what you said, is to engage in preventing this erosion of all the contacts we have with them so we don't run into some dangerous incident and have really bad things that are going to happen because we can't talk to each other in a tenseful situation. And that's going to get worse because there is accusations that Russia has violated the INF treaty, And, there is going to be within Washington a movement to sort of say, well, what does that really mean for us? We have to think harder about that. And a number of Europeans are going to, make the same case. So that is the most dangerous piece, that we don't have those challenges. The whole confidence building, security building measures that we developed over decades have eroded, and there's nothing replacing them. But third, I realize it's hard, and I realize the difficulty. What I was about to say, you have to engage Russians, not just the Kremlin. And it's very hard. I get it, but that shouldn't stop us from doing it. Maybe it's probably not governments in the first instance. And there, I think that ultimately is, again, what would bind us to Russia is the same type of thing where I was talking about across the Atlantic. It's our societies in the end that are the ones that determine, and we don't have much of an initiative going on how to engage Russians versus, Russia.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We have to engage Americans, Russians, and Europeans. And this is what we are trying to do. And thanks a lot, Dan.
Thank you all for coming.
I think it was a very interesting final step of our mission to Washington. Let's stay in touch, and we will discuss again. Thank you.
Okay,
thank you to all.
Thank you. No, I totally agree with you.
Okay. That's why we're here. Entertain. Yes, thank you. I give people other people's cards. Hold on a second.
Bravo.
Sometimes,
Thank you. Yes.